welcome, welcome. Hi, everybody. My name is Hassan Akmal. I'm the Executive Director of the UCLA Career Center. Thanks for joining us today. We have a few hundred registered from all over the world, so we're excited to be sharing today. Before I do get started with today's program, I want to take a moment to thank my co-pilot, Michelle Ryan, Associate Director of Industry Relations and Experiential Learning here at UCLA's Career Center, as well as the planning committee for the conference, as well as today's session. Michelle, Denise, Sanaz, Stella, Rick, Adrian, and Precious. They really helped us put together a great program, the program really wouldn't have happened without them. So I want to thank them tremendously for all of their assistance. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. Hello, Suzanne from UC Irvine. UC Irvine in the house. Welcome, Barry. This is actually the second part of the Future of Career Services Symposium. This morning, we had a wonderful UCLA University Career Services retreat where Pulin joined us and spoke very intimately to our staff. And so this is the second part, which is open to all. Again, a couple hundred registered from all over the world, including Canada. Thanks so much for joining us on a Friday. All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started in the interest of time. Welcome to the culmination of UCLA's Future of Work Conference, the UCLA Career Center's Future of Career Services Symposium. It's exciting to see so many familiar as well as new faces here. And this is where we need to be, right? This is right here, sharing best practices, collectively problem solving as we are all in this together. We often use the word career as a synonym for occupation, trade, profession, or vocation. This definition refers to what a person does to earn a living. It's formally defined as an occupation undertaken for a significant period of time with opportunities for progress. Yet in the modern age, we are seeing people change careers more and more frequently. Longevity at any one place in any one career has significantly decreased. Thus, a change in the historical definition is long overdue. The future of work is uncertain. How can we learn to be disrupting and not be disrupted? Is it even possible? Career disruption was here before the pandemic was. It has accelerated changes we are seeing in our paradigm. Prior, even before within our economic landscape, we were seeing people questioning their careers more often and voluntarily leaving scripted lives in search of meaningful work. They were also seeking purpose-driven organizations that foster engagement, commitment, and the motivation to make an impact. Is the secret ingredient of extraordinary companies and organizations purpose? There are thousands of careers, both traditional and non-traditional, not to mention the wealth of niches. Many of them require extensive education and training. Many others require little to no experience. Today, we will completely subvert the historical concept of a career. Why we must be informed connectors. This is about defining and developing the new career, mastering diverse occupations that can't be reduced to a single title or trajectory. They surrender only to genuine merit. This is about helping all students, regardless of social capital and background, helping them find their inspiration and following that inspiration with bold moves. We all get asked the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? doctor, lawyer, engineer. How many of us are where we imagine we would be 5, 10, or 20 years ago? Our youth will now have at least 15 careers over a lifetime. Many will have multiple careers and side hustles at the same time. If this is all true, then what are we doing to keep up with the change? How do we become the new breed of career professionals? How can we use our collective wisdom to move the needle forward into the future? To help us with that, we have a very special guest. Allow me to introduce Pulin Sanghvi. I first met Pulin Sanghvi while attending a NACE roundtable at Princeton University. What he didn't know at the time was that I had been following him since his days at Stanford, and I was what you would call a big fan. His article in NACE entitled Reimagining Career Services, co-authored with Eva, was mandatory reading from my staff while I was at Columbia University. We met and instantly hit it off, having dinner with the Handshake CEO that same evening. I was struck by his eloquence and warmth, as he not only offered me a ride home, and New York City is not that close to Princeton. I kindly declined, but he still extended an invitation and welcomed me into his home. We have been in touch and friends ever since. A few years later, he was a guest speaker at Columbia University's You Matter program, a career and life design workshop. The students kept him afterwards like a rock star, at least for an hour and until closing. Fast forward within another reimagination or reimagining our reimagination of career services, he's graciously here with us today. So what is Pulin up to now? Pulin is a speaker and author on the topic of purpose and meaningful work. He's based in San Francisco's Bay Area. He speaks to organizations like Google and YPO, Young Presidents Organization, and universities including Yale, Stanford, and Princeton. He can now add UCLA to this list, as he's an honorary Bruin. Pulin led structural reimagining of career development at Princeton University and at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And he created and taught a model of hypothesis-driven exploration that has engaged thousands of members of the Princeton, Stanford, and Yale communities. Pulin was named Inaugural Executive Director of Career Services at Princeton in 2013. He was deeply involved with the university strategic planning process in the areas of entrepreneurship, service, civic engagement, and the future of the graduate school. He was a fellow in each of Princeton's residential colleges and an academic athletic fellow for the Princeton football team. Pulin previously served as the Assistant Dean and Director for the Career Management Center at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. There he focused his center on the personalized exploration of meaningful work. Pulin was formerly a management consultant with McKinsey in Palo Alto, serving software and services clients, and an investment banker with Morgan Stanley in New York. Pulin holds an MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business and a BA summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa with distinction in economics from Yale. Pulin serves Yale in multiple capacities, including as a fellow in Davenport College, as secretary of Yale Club of San Francisco, and as Alumni Schools Committee Director for the San Francisco Peninsula. He previously served as the executive officer of the Yale Alumni Association Board of Governors. About today's topic and keynote. The title is Forging Inspiration, Career Centers and the Free Agent Economy. In the last decade, university students have been pursuing more diverse and empowered career paths than previous generations had access to. For many students, finding purpose and meaningful work at the beginning of their careers has become of paramount importance. At the same time, the rapidly changing economy has created asymmetric opportunities for exploration, risk-taking, and impact. In this talk today, Pulin Sanghvi will explore the role of the modern career center in inspiring students to develop an individual definition of meaningful work, and then to effectively support those students in charting deeply personal paths forward, taking full advantage of the asymmetric opportunities embedded in the modern economy. Drawing from his experience leading reimaginings of career development ecosystems at Princeton and Stanford Graduate School of Business, and his experience at Yale Alumni Association Board of Governors, Pulin will offer strategies and best practices to orient career centers on the themes of inspiration, nimble exploration, and personalization. Without further ado, we'd like to welcome Pulin Sanghvi. Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan, and I'd like to express special thanks to the wonderful team at UCLA for making today's presentation possible. I know people are calling in from all over the country and other parts of the world, and I wanted to start by saying that I hope that each of you and your loved ones are staying safe amidst all the challenges of this pandemic. This has been an extraordinary year, one that has given so many challenges to us individually and collectively, but that I think has brought us together as the human species. And we are starting to see sunlight, at least in the US, and I hope that you will continue to stay safe and healthy. In the fall of 2014, about a year after I started at Princeton, I had the chance to spend a day on campus with His Holiness the Dalai Lama when he visited the Princeton campus. In a wonderful book called The Art of Happiness at Work, the Dalai Lama lays out a simple, elegant, three-part framework for what motivates each of us to do the work that we do. His first bucket is what he describes as job. Job is when you're working for acquisition of resources, putting food on the table, and getting your family to the next day. If you think about it, almost everybody who's lived in the history of our civilization has fallen in the job bucket. And if you find yourself in the job bucket, it's often very difficult to move yourself out of it. His second bucket, the one that most of us on this call fall into, and the one that most of our centers are geared towards supporting, is what he describes as career. Career is when acquisition of resources and putting food on the table is no longer your primary motivation, but instead now you're focused on status, advancement, recognition, and promotion. On the surface, it feels intuitively better and intuitively easier to be in the career bucket than to be in the job bucket. But what the Dalai Lama argues from his perspective in Eastern philosophy is that job and career are not so different from each other, because in both cases, you may find your happiness vested in things external to yourself that you may find over time you have only limited control over. So he posits a third bucket that he believes all of us should be aspiring to, which he describes as calling. Calling is work that is fundamentally aligned with who you are and what matters most to you. It's work that finds the perfect intersection between the problems in the world that you're most passionate about solving and where the best of yourself can manifest against those problems. It's work you would continue to do if you no longer need status, advancement, or money. It's work that you would do for the sake of the work itself. The theme of what I'm going to be talking about today is really about reinvention, and I'm going to be talking about it at multiple levels. I'll be talking about reinvention of the economy and how the economy is structurally changing. I'll be talking about career centers, using what we learned at Princeton and Stanford and what we learned at Yale to sort of weave a narrative of how career centers have been evolving to how the economy is changing. And then I'll be talking quite a bit about reinvention of our students and how important that skill will be as a core part of what we teach. And I thought it might be good to start my presentation maybe with a little bit of a metaphor. So I'm going to share a little book from my collection with you. This is a copy of the poems of John Keats. And this is a particularly interesting copy of the book. It was found at a used bookstore in Oxford in England, and was determined to have belonged to Tom York, who is the lead singer of my very favorite band in the world, a band called Radiohead. Now, I'm guessing 90% of those of you on the call have never heard of Radiohead or may only have heard of them in passing. But it's not an exaggeration to say that Radiohead has become recognized as being similarly impactful to maybe being the Pink Floyd of our time. In 1997, Radiohead released a seminal album called OK Computer that took the guitar album to its logical conclusion. It was an album that was ambitious, that lyrically talked about uh, isolation in the age of technology. It did things to sort of morph its songs, but was firmly based in Radiohead and Britpop's kind of tradition of guitars. And the album was extraordinarily successful and was recognized by many critics and many fans as having been the definitive album of the 1990s. Then Radiohead went off and started kind of thinking about what they wanted to do next. And in the year 2000, released their next album, an album called Kid A. Kid A at the time seemed like a complete left turn from where they had left off on OK Computer. It let go of the guitars completely and brought in new instruments and different types of song structures, and largely let go of verses and choruses, largely let go of melody. It was an album that fused jazz and electronic influences, and it seemed to come completely out of left field. And when it was released, many of the critics savaged it as something they didn't understand, that they thought was obtuse and whatever. Just this last year, Rolling Stone named Kid A, that weird, crazy album, as number 20 on its list of the 500 albums, 500 best albums of all time, ahead of such stalwarts as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and The Dark Side of the Moon. And as I look through this book, which is filled with annotations, it's filled with lyric fragments, and it's filled with ideas, what's fascinating to me is to see the mind of Tom York working, to see the passion and the vision and the discipline he's brought into this. And so really this is a metaphor for a lot of what I'm going to be talking today about reinvention. And I think the core thing with reinvention is that, often a reinvention is not clear until you're looking at it in the rearview mirror. And a big part of what we did with our reinventions at Princeton and Stanford was starting to prepare students for what the economy would bring, what the generational shift is going to be. And instead of trying to help them figure out everything ahead of time, we tried to teach them to be adaptive and to keep being able to sort of be mindful and intentional across a lifetime, to be able to keep evolving and iterating their visions of what defined them and how they wanted to engage with the world. I first started to see signs of the generational shift when I was an undergraduate in college at Yale. I was an economics major, and when I walked into Yale's career office, it seemed like the whole world was nothing but investment banks and consulting firms. And sure enough, I found my way first to Morgan Stanley, the investment bank, and then to McKinsey, the consulting firm, both which were extraordinary choices and heavily shaped who I became professionally. But honestly, when I walked into the career office, I didn't think I had any choice. It didn't occur to me that the world might be a little bit bigger and a little bit broader in terms of what I could pursue beyond the fields that were readily available, the traditional sort of lanes that were laid out in Yale's career office in the early 1990s. I had a classmate in my residential college at Yale, Davenport College, who had a lot of courage and was somebody who many of us watched with both admiration and awe as her career began to come together. She had been a history and political science focused student who was particularly interested in the topic of genocide. She wanted to understand what caused genocide in modern society and what could be done to prevent it. At graduation, she did something that at the time seemed very risky. She got on a plane and began traveling Bosnia, covering the war unfolding there as a journalist, and spent 3 years doing that. She returned to the United States for law school and then began documenting everything she had seen in Bosnia in a book that ended up getting recognized as perhaps the seminal book ever written on the topic of genocide. And at an early age, she ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize. Her work got recognized by Senator Obama as he was beginning to articulate his foreign policy views. And President Obama named my classmate Samantha Power to be his United States ambassador to the United Nations. Samantha's story is so interesting because it was so atypical at the time when I was in college, but really pointed the way to the empowerment and trust in self that would become the core of how the economy evolves. Samantha trusted herself and didn't, I'm sure when she was launching into traveling Bosnia as a journalist, probably had no idea how she'd make a living being a journalist. But her passion and her faith against solving this problem in the world that she most cared about was able to carry her to places that I'm sure she never could have predicted, but which opened up to her in a unique way. And it's interesting because it's easy to imagine Samantha being talented enough to be a wonderful lawyer or banker or consultant. But it's hard to imagine the Samantha Power that we all know, the passionate advocate for human rights on the floor of the United Nations, having had the chance to emerge if she had not taken that early risk. And therein kind of lies the trap that I myself fell into and that I worry about. I worried about consistently as I was running my centers at Stanford and Princeton, which is that finding jobs for our students is not enough and may not even be enough of a value add to justify the existence of our centers. Our students are so energetic, they're talented, they would be absorbed in many different parts of the economy. And really, I think our goal is to help students navigate very personalized paths towards alignment. And Samantha did all of this on her own. But I started to see, the second time I saw the generational shift starting to happen was when I was a MBA student at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and started to see, while some of us were still pursuing the traditional paths, started to see some of my classmates in that first internet boom in the late 90s starting to start companies and starting to create opportunities to take bets on themselves. I'll tell you the story of two classmates in particular, Zia Chisti and Kelsey Worth. Zia was a classmate of mine at Morgan Stanley. He had been in the M&A division of Morgan Stanley and was actually thinking pretty seriously about going back to Morgan Stanley. And Kelsey had been a management consultant with a consulting firm called the Monitor Group that and had every opportunity in front of her at graduation. They started working on a startup, but amidst the heart of the internet boom, decided to go after something different than an internet-related company. Zia had worn these heavy metallic braces when he had been growing up, and he was starting to wonder whether advances in computer science and material science could make a difference in how people addressed braces. They knew nothing about orthodontics, but they were able to find a orthodontist in Palo Alto who adopted them as a mentor and served as an advisor to what they were building. They knew nothing about building a product, but they were able to walk across the Stanford campus and find students in the computer science department and the sort of material science departments who were able to help them to build their early prototypes. And then one of our classmates, Michael Palmer, who had been an intern at Kleiner Perkins, introduced them to Joe Lacob, who was, I think many of you may know him as the owner of the Golden State Warriors, and he was the lead healthcare partner at Kleiner Perkins, who funded their company, and that's how Align Technology, the Invisalign company, was born. I think that what was interesting as I watched the story of so many of the entrepreneurs from my time at the GSB, watch their careers play out over 15 or 20 years, is that, at graduation, I think many of us who went the more traditional path had some feelings about risk and relative security that probably influenced our decisions. I think there might have been a sense that if I go off and do consulting or something like that, I'll have a nice, steady, predictable path forward. And if I start a company and become an entrepreneur, maybe I'll have like a 1 in 10 chance of being really successful and a 9 in 10 chance of flaming out and spending the rest of my life living in a van down by the river. And that was a confusion between what you can think of as event risk versus what you can think of as more structural career risk. Though my classmates who started companies, sure enough, they all launched companies. Some of them made it the first time around, but then others didn't make it the first time, but they were dedicated to entrepreneurship. And it turned out that entrepreneurship was a discipline that you could master. You could become better at it by going through the entrepreneurial cycle a few times. You could learn things that would make you more likely to succeed later on. And what happened over a 20-year span is those who didn't make it the first time as entrepreneurs tended to make it the second time, the third time, or the fourth time, so that over the course of like a 20-year span, they had more event volatility, more ups and downs than those of us who took the more steady path forward, but they often had more of a steep trajectory to where they were trying to get to. Almost like the difference between investing in a stock portfolio, lots of ups and downs, but a high trajectory forward versus a bond portfolio. And the real risk that many of us didn't recognize at the time is what you can think of as a competency trap. Think back again to my classmate Samantha Power. Easy to imagine her doing something traditional. And what if she ended up starting one of those paths and ended up being good at it and good enough at it to keep getting promoted, to keep moving forward? But where that sparkle, that Samantha Power level of inspiration never had a chance to emerge. And that competency trap is something that I worried a lot about with my students. I worried that they'd start on a job, get to the point where they started to overcommit to that job without, in many cases, being able to really articulate why they chose it in the first place, and then having all these incentives why it would be hard to switch away from it. My last kind of early sign on how the economy was changing was during my time at McKinsey. I was part of the Palo Alto Silicon Valley office, and they tend to wrangle the local consultants to lead the recruiting efforts at the local universities. And I was one of the co-leaders of McKinsey's firm-wide recruiting back at Stanford. And one of the things that we started to see in the late 90s during the internet boom was we were starting to lose people that we had never lost before. And we were losing them to completely unexpected destinations, in many cases to companies we'd never heard of before. And there were a lot of internal discussions. There were some disbelief. What's happening? And what has changed that has made these new destinations so attractive? I started to, I had a view on what was going on, but I was able to find a name for it. And it happened just a couple of years ago. I have been involved for a long time with a nonprofit organization that has really changed the course of my life. It's a nonprofit organization called Positive Coaching Alliance that is working to change the win at all cost culture around youth sports. And they were my McKinsey client. I helped them figure out how to become a national organization, which they are now in 2007 and 2008. And I stayed on their national board of directors for the next decade, and they became really important to me. And through them, I got to meet and become exposed to many of the legendary coaches and athletes in professional sports who care a lot about helping our kids succeed. So I was very interested as a hardcore Golden State Warriors fan on what unfolded when we had a dominant Warriors team during the kind of 2016 to 2019 period, when Kevin Durant, one of the great basketball players of all time, maybe the second best player in the league, joined a 73-win team, and they became dominant. In the third year of Kevin Durant's time with the team, there was a period in the fall of 2018 when he had a well-publicized spat with one of the other Warriors players, a guy named Draymond Green. And there was a lot of speculation that Kevin might be getting ready to leave the team the following year and go off and strike it off on his own. And many people were really confused on why he would do that. Not only were the Warriors clearly and far and away his best chance of continuing to win championships over the long haul, but in addition to that, they could pay him the most money. He was able to earn somewhere in the neighborhood of $38 or $40 million more in a contract term with the Warriors than he would be able to earn by switching teams. So I actually had the chance to attend a small lunch with Warriors coach Steve Kerr right after the Draymond Green spat happened, and we asked him that question. And Steve was very matter of fact about how he saw the situation. He said that Kevin might very well leave the following summer and that it was absolutely his right to do so. He said that Kevin was going to be a free agent, and free agency was a fact of life in the league. It was something that every athlete earned the right to do. And when asked kind of how the Warriors were preparing, how they were dealing, how they were thinking about that, potential impending free agency, he said, we're trying to find joy in the moment. We're trying to enjoy everything that this run this year gives us, and we're trying to live in the moment and trying to make the most of everything we have right now. Kevin Durant later articulated his reasons for leaving the Warriors, which is that he was seeking personal growth. He felt that he had gone as far as he could in his own development as a basketball player, and he felt empowered to want to try to do something he hadn't done before, which is have his own team and build it in a new geography. And that brought him to the Brooklyn Nets. And now you'll see the Nets are one of the front runners, perhaps the front runner to win the NBA championship this year. So that idea of the free agency economy is really kind of what I want to spend the bulk of today's time talking about. What I've seen over the last 2 decades working closely with students has been that the economy has radically reoriented. One of the good things that's come out of it is that students have radically more choice, and they have dramatically different choice than any previous generation has had. We see this with the growth of the entrepreneurial and the startup economy, but it's really happened across all industries and all fields. We see that, for example, there's been the rise of new social ventures. There has been what many of these jobs represent is a different kind of value proposition to early stage professionals. Not as much structure, maybe not as much learning from very experienced professionals, maybe not playing on as large of a stage, but then having all this early empowerment, being able to run something, being able to steer the ship dramatically to the left or dramatically to the right, being able to see your company grow very quickly, being able to see where that will bring you. And it's not that being in a startup or a small company or a small social organization is better or worse than being in a larger organization, but it represents for the first time students having radically different choices in front of them and being able to make those choices in an empowered way. It also means that the larger companies have had to adapt. They've had to change their experiences to be competitive in many cases with what the small companies and the startups are offering. The net result of that has been that for many younger professionals, they have radically more learning opportunities early in their career. They often get different types of responsibility options. There is for sure much less institutional security and much less much less of a safety net that, my dad worked for the same company, Standard Oil of Indiana, which later became Amoco his whole career. And there was almost like a lifelong compact between him and the company. Students will never have that again, but they do have a lot of fluidity in how they can shape their career. They can go in and out of the workforce. They can create full-time portfolios or a mix of full-time and project work, or put gigs together. They can be working on stuff on the side. There's an unprecedented amount of flexibility and fluidity in what they're able to create. Coming out of the pandemic, there's extraordinary geographic fluidity. I see this with people who are now taking on roles, how companies are becoming multi-local companies that often don't even have a large headquarters. It's just almost a conglomeration of people working out of their homes, and how that's going to continue to become. Careers are becoming much more deeply personalized. And what's tending to happen, what we saw with our students at Princeton and at Yale and at Stanford, is that their career identities and their personal brands are starting to evolve in deeply personalized ways, which are informed, if everything goes right, by what you can think of as a learning spiral that begins while they're in school that continues over the course of their lifetime. The learning spiral is a term that was coined by two of my beloved colleagues on the Service and Civic Engagement Steering Committee at Princeton. And what the term connotes is the idea that learning can be self-reinforcing, and that when you start down the path of intentionally learning and building new types of learning into yourself, all the learning that comes after it starts to build on what you've learned before, so that as you start to move from generalization to specialization into what you can think of as mastery, you start to become hyper specialized, but what you are able to do is bring something into the work situations that you have that is completely unique and that is able to completely differentiate you in those work situations. In my case, there was so much that I've learned over the course of my time at McKinsey about strategy, about vision, about building coalitions and building alignment that it would directly inform the identity that I was able to form at Princeton and Stanford as a change agent and as somebody who was able to act as an entrepreneur within the university. And so for our students, that's the life that we're going to be preparing them for. It's also true as kind of part and parcel as their identities are becoming much more personal. It means recruiting and the way they find their way into companies is becoming much more relational, and it's happening in much more personal ways. So the days of companies sort of owning the recruiting process has radically changed. And certainly within the systems that I was part of, alumni relationships ended up becoming for many of our students, much more important and much more impactful than employer relationships ended up being. And I can talk more about that a little bit later. I think the one thing I'll say that has come out of all of this generational shift that has been the most empowering thing about it has been that meaning and purpose have become front and center for so many students. The thing that I constantly see with my students is that they're actively thinking about what meaning and purpose mean to them personally. How do they personally define the problems in the world that they most want to solve, and how do they want to engage with it? And that has become front and center for them. Like Kevin Durant, willing to leave a lot of money and a lot of winning behind in order to go find his own path. That sense of I want to create, I want to be sort of an owner, but not an owner of a company necessarily. I want to be like an owner of my own path forward so that I don't spend an endless amount of time kind of paying my dues, working my way up a ladder, getting to the point where I'm given the chance to do something interesting. I want every step of the way to matter. And that, if you think about it, that's the heart of, I use the metaphor of Radiohead, going off and creating the album that the whole world is confused by when it comes out, but then 20 years later, everybody is following them. And that's what we've seen. So in the change processes that I led at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and then led on similar but some key different dimensions at Princeton, I want to start by just saying that the reimagining processes, which first began in 2009 when I started at Stanford, were kind of ambitious, swing for the fence efforts that really required upending virtually every sort of holy grail part of our our models, being willing to question every assumption, and then getting not just my organizations, but getting all of our university stakeholders aligned to go swing for the fences. And a couple of things I want to say just generally about leading a change process, and particularly if you're going to try to lead that change process on a rapid timeline and you're going to try to be as effective as you can. I guess there are some starting principles. The first starting principle is that it's important to start with a vision that has a cohesive philosophy behind it. And as we talk about in the nonprofit world, should have a theory of change. I think that one thing I've had an observation is that many career offices are now in the process of reinventing themselves to what you can think of as a more purpose or meaning-based model, one where they're having really great conversations with their students, while at the same time working very hard to try to get the mechanical sides of the model, how we match students with alumni, how we foster mentorship, how we kind of foster or broker our employer ecosystems. All of that is really valuable to be happening together as part of an overriding philosophy. And having that philosophy, knowing what it is and being able to articulate it was for us really helpful, because as we were consistent with what we were trying to build, we found that the president, the provost, the chief operating officer, the trustees, the alumni body, and the student body were all able to rally around what we were building. And because everyone understood what we were building, because everybody sort of knew what we were going after, It both was very helpful in us being able to secure resources and key support from all of our key stakeholders. It might be volunteer support, it might be financial support. But importantly, it also gave us some room to really take risks and experiment and have the chance to fall flat on our face on some of what we did. And because people knew what we were trying to do, and because in both of the institutions I was part of, there was such a hunger among the students and among the administration and the faculty for change, it really just helped us to build momentum that built on itself. A little bit like those first 100 days in office that they talk about, where if you get those first 100 days right, you're able to create an accelerating momentum behind change that starts to happen. The second thing I want to say, just as a general principle of change, is that your team becomes absolutely critical to the change that you are driving. We felt very strongly on the teams that I was part of that there were shared norms that we felt were very important to try to work off of. Specifically, the norms that we wanted to empower across my organizations were collaboration, uh, which really meant not just working together, but bringing down the walls between organizations so that there was much more communication and cross-functionality. So for example, between counseling and employer relations. And we accomplished this through a lot of different means, including the way that we set our team culture, the way that we held events, the way that we fostered communication, the way that we all engaged with the change process. But we also, importantly, started getting different members of our team experimenting with the other side of what our organization was doing. Our employer relations teams became wonderful counselors to students in their areas of expertise. And our counseling team became wonderful ambassadors to us as we were meeting with alumni and their companies. And that was a really important part of what we built. We also felt it was really important to be entrepreneurial and to be risk embracing. And that is terminology that's thrown around a lot. But I do think that the core of it is that you have to not just accept, but you have to embrace and actively seek some quotient of failure so that you can start to really push your organization towards what it's really capable of doing. It's one of these things where you have to be willing to question every assumption. You have to be willing to celebrate failure as it's happening. And you have to do it in a way where everybody who's part of the organization really trusts that swinging for the fences and taking good risks is always something that's celebrated, even if the outcome of it was not what we hoped it would be. And then the last part of a team culture that I think is really critical is that every voice counts all the way through the organization. Within McKinsey's context, we had a powerful norm called the obligation to dissent. And that meant that if somebody who was on the ground might be the most junior member of the organization, that person might have an insight on the problem you're trying to solve that would be critical to how the recommendations ultimately unfold. And it was not just the right of that person, but it was actually the duty and the obligation of that person to speak up during team meetings, to question assumptions, and to try to push the thinking forward and what happens. And I think that that idea of creating a truly non-hierarchical organization, and organizations will always be a little bit hierarchical, they have to be, decisions have to happen at some level. But if you can really trust every member of your team, believe in every member of your team, have an active development culture, believe that every member of your team can rapidly move forward, fight internally for promotions, your team will feel energized about their careers, and all of us are working really hard. They'll be making magic because they're feeling it, and they're starting to feel the energy in their own careers that you're trying to create for your students. Um, our reimagining was based on a few kind of structural initiatives, all of which tied into the theme of personalization, and particularly the personalized exploration of meaningful work. The heart of our identity and the heart of our brand, the heart of almost everything we did with the students, was a model of hypothesis-driven exploration that I had created during my time at Stanford, and I've now taught it to so many students across my universities and now outside the universities. Um, the core of the hypothesis-driven approach is, uh, and my inspiration for this was a little bit my time at McKinsey when we would take on big ambiguous client problems, not get scared by what we didn't know, which at the beginning of a McKinsey engagement is pretty much everything, but instead start thoughtfully laying stakes in the ground, articulating our best thinking on where we think the answer lies, not getting hung up on whether those stakes are right or wrong, but instead that they were testable. What we taught students through our work at Stanford and Princeton is to take that way of solving problems and turn it back on themselves, to start getting in the habit of systematically framing great questions, the questions that would be most important to the immediate decisions in front of them. And then to start to systematically learn how to transform their experiences and interactions on campus into a grand laboratory, to start actively testing their assumptions, evolving and iterating them. And then as they start to settle some of the things that they're most unsure about, to keep surfacing new questions that'll continue to guide them in rapidly evolving their definition of what defines them and how they want to engage with the world. This was a very resonant model across the universities, and it became not just something that we taught in large format, but also something that became the core of how we counseled students, the core of how we led discussions with students when they were together with us, and how students had discussions with alumni. Now, just to bring it to life a little bit, I want to give an example of one of my students at Stanford who really embraced this approach and how it unfolded for him. My student had come into the MBA program with previous work experience, both at McKinsey, the consulting firm, and at Bain Capital, the private equity firm. And he was really focused on the space of clean energy, but didn't quite know exactly how he wanted to engage with it. As he started working on his hypothesis, he started thinking about who in the world aspirationally he most admired and kind of wanted to become. And he didn't think about it in terms of a specific person, but more in terms of a role. And he realized that that aspirational role for him was the Secretary of Energy of the United States, which he felt would put him right at the intersection of technology, policy, and all the innovation that was happening around clean energy. So he started to work backwards from that. What do I need to be an expert in order to be a candidate to be the Secretary of Energy in the United States? And as he thought about it, he realized that over the course of his lifetime, energy was likely to be generated in many different places and in many different forms. There would be traditional energy generation. There would be new sources like wind and solar and hydro. And the challenge facing the Secretary of Energy in his lifetime would be place shifting and time shifting the energy from where it was created to where it was most needed. So that led him to have a new part of his hypothesis, which is that if I'm going to be Secretary of Energy one day, I've got to be the world's expert on storage. I need to understand how to make batteries work. So he spent his first summer working with the Department of Energy, and then started networking with venture capital firms to try to find the right landing spot for his permanent job in his second year. And he ended up finding a startup company working on car batteries that had been funded by Kleiner Perkins and Khosla Ventures. And so he realized the car battery company was going to be his next destination. So he started to work backwards from there. What do I need to be good at in order to be successful in this company? He was going to be in first of all, the company was run by heavy technology engineering type people. So he realized that he would have to learn basic chemical engineering so that he'd be fluent with all the technical people in his company. So he ended up getting chemical engineering textbooks from the Stanford bookstore and started teaching himself basic chemical engineering. He also realized that he'd be in a sales role and would have to be able to speak the language of the car manufacturers that he'd be interfacing with directly in his sales role. So he ended up taking a night course at our local community college, De Anza College, focused on helping people prepare to be auto mechanics. At graduation, he said, Pulin, I'm pretty sure that car batteries is not where I want to spend a lot of time. I'm really hoping to shift at some point over to different uses of battery, particularly home batteries. But those jobs don't yet exist. But sure enough, several years later, Tesla really got going with its Powerwall division, and his perfect job had been created. Uh, Years ago, he had been able to predict the job that he would be able to see come into being just a few years later. And so the hypothesis-driven approach is different for all of our students. Some of them start with just very unformed opinions and then just start to find parts of themselves. I have an interest in writing. I have an interest in working with people. How do I test that? How do I develop that? How do I evolve it? And our model, which has a lot of content behind it, and some of this will be in a book that will have coming out in the next year or so, um, is really targeted at empowering a mindset of lifelong exploration and mindful, intentional approach to listening and integrating everything that you experience back into an evolving worldview of what defines you and how you want to engage with the world. Now, one of the nice side effects of this program is that in addition to it becoming very popular with the students, all the MBA students took it voluntarily, or almost all of them. And at Princeton, we had thousands of participants, and we've had large audiences as well at Yale. One of the nice side effects is that the philosophy behind this happens to merge very nicely with the academic philosophy of these institutions. What this really is at its core is sort of an articulation of the spirit of exploration embedded in the liberal arts curriculum. And so one of the nice things at both Stanford and at Princeton is that we had heavy support from the faculty. I even had the dean of the college at Princeton personally attend my session herself and encouraging her faculty and her college administration to attend it as well. What happened through that is that we ended up having language and concepts that became widely spread through the Princeton community. We had alumni and faculty, when they were meeting with students, referencing some of these same concepts. And it became kind of this empowering identity to our organization. People stopped thinking of us as the place where they came for the mechanical things and started thinking about us as the place they would come to discover parts of themselves that they didn't know existed. And I think that that investment in exploration, and particularly personalized supportive exploration, becomes really important to the idea of helping students navigate their very personalized job searches in the current economy. A second thing that we paid a lot of attention towards was mentorship and the way that we connect alumni in particular with our students. Mentorship is something that is sort of overused in our field, and I've seen such a growth in wonderful technology that supports mentorship engagement in different ways. And it's wonderful to see that happening on campus. So at Yale, we've had a wonderful platform called Cross Campus that's powered by People Grove that we're seeing some wonderful results from. Students are having wonderful conversations and some good stuff is happening. The concept that I want to get you thinking about is the idea of chains of mentorship. It's this idea that all mentorship is not created equal. I think, for example, of my niece, who was an undergraduate at Yale, and she connected with one of her assigned mentors through Cross Campus. It was somebody that she ended up not really knowing anything about when she first connected with him, had a good conversation. Her reaction afterwards was, I liked him, and I really appreciated that he took time to talk to me. And it was a good conversation. I think I got something out of it. But I think about that compared to a different type of mentorship that I've seen happen in a way that is transformative with some of my students. I think of one of my classmates at the GSB who sort of cornered John Doerr, the esteemed venture capitalist from Kleiner Perkins, after he had given a speech in our auditorium. And in the course of a few minutes, convinced him to have a longer conversation. And then that longer conversation convinced him to create what has now become the well-established internship program at Kleiner Perkins. And John Doerr became a close and ongoing mentor to him, who started to really cross over from being a thought partner into being a true sponsor, creating opportunities for my classmate. And among the other things that came out of that relationship is that my classmate was given the opportunity to run one of Kleiner's largest invested portfolio companies at the age of like 26 or 27, which was an extraordinary growth opportunity for him. And one of the things I've seen with my students at Stanford and Princeton and Yale is that many of them who have had their careers really start to change trajectory have had a breakthrough moment. And those breakthrough moments have often been catalyzed by deep, active engagement by a super active mentor. And so we invested a lot in our mentorship ecosystem, not in just trying to get half-hour conversations going willy-nilly, but trying to replicate the feel of how relationships really come. And one of the big outcomes of that was that we fostered mentorship through many different channels, live interaction, through a formal mentorship program. But we also started working with our Alumni Association and with the provost and the executive vice president and the chief technology officer to go deep into the work of creating a social network for our university that would bring people together for casual conversation in areas of shared affiliation, shared interest, and shared intent. I'll talk more at some point. I don't have time to go deep into everything we learned from that. But I think the big thing that I want to emphasize on mentorship is it's important to recognize that it's hard to force chemistry. So these sort of assigned mentorship programs, we at least have had mixed success with. And instead, we found that by doing everything we can to forge organic, low commitment, low early commitment interaction between students and lots of alumni, and lots of students, we found that deeper, more natural, and more pervasive connections happen through that. And then with our employer system, we radically regeared everything towards serving and helping and supporting smaller companies and smaller organizations and startups in being able to succeed within our system. And this diversification of our employer ecosystem had just extraordinary results. At Stanford, we found across 800 MBA students that we, in my last 2 years there, hit all-time highs in the number of students starting companies, somewhere in the neighborhood of 18% of the class. And of the remaining 600 or so MBA students, we got to the point where they were spreading out across more than 350 discrete employers, which meant that our scale employers would only hire 4 or 5 students in a year, and 80% of our employer base would only hire 1 student. If any of you are interested offline, I can talk about what that restructuring of the employer ecosystem looked like, but it basically meant really rethinking every part of how our recruiting system worked, getting rid of things that didn't work, like job fairs, and replacing them with new ways of fostering more organic connection between students and recruiters. It meant using information in different ways to foster personalized connection. Today, there are these wonderful platforms like Handshake that enable this personalized connection between students and employers. When I was at the GSB in 2009, we were doing everything by using a student profile and Excel spreadsheets in a quick and dirty way to profile the interests of our entire class, and then using that to drive personalized connection. We affectionately called it the eHarmony model, and if you're interested in how that evolved over time, you can Google my name and eHarmony and Poets and Quants. There was a lot written about it at that time. So I want to shift now to kind of how I think the economy is going to shift in the years ahead. And I think the big thing is that skill-based identities are going to become rapidly displaced in unpredictable ways much faster than they previously have been. And I think that that's going to have major implications rippling through the economy. I was with the founder of one of the leading ride-sharing companies, and we were talking about this question of how they think about being advocates for all the drivers that they employ across the world, and at the same time they're making all these investments in self-driving vehicles, which at some point is going to put all these people out of work. And it was a very uncomfortable part of the conversation where we started to shift to, well, the PC industry, when it came around, displaced lots of people out of their jobs, and but it also created a lot of new jobs. But I think what may have gotten overlooked in that conversation is that it wasn't the same people who lost the jobs who were able to take all these new jobs. And so I think what's going to happen in the decade ahead is that displacement of skills is going to happen much more rapidly. And As that happens, you're going to start to find entire groups of people struggling to find their new place in the economy. And that might lead to political realignment. It might lead to societal unrest. It might lead to rampant policy changes. But at the core of it, the thing that'll be most important for society to invest in is the mechanisms for education to shift from being something that you do at the beginning of your life and then never do again to sort of a rapid, lifelong, constant model of re-education where we are good as a society of having people being able to get educated in different ways over the course of a lifetime, for them to be able to get new forms of credentials that they'll be able to carry back into the workplace, and for us to be able to systematically as a society be able to bring everyone along with us as technology and artificial intelligence and automation begin to create mass displacement. For students in many of our institutions who may, be somewhat insulated, for example, from the loss of blue collar jobs, but where they instead are still thinking about their careers in terms of I'm going to learn a set of skills. Maybe I'll learn how to be a computer science coder and I'll just keep going forward with that. I think one of the most important skills we can teach them in our ecosystems is really constant reinvention. Being able to take that active listening, intentional mindset and being able to constantly use that to direct them to keep evolving and iterating their versions of themselves into that phase of mastery where they become uniquely valuable against a big problem in the world that they really care about solving. And three skills that are not emphasized enough, but I think are going to be critical. One is going to be just that process of reinvention and everything that's involved with that. The second is being able to spot and assess asymmetric, or what you might think of as breakthrough opportunities as they're happening. Not every risk is a good risk to take, but being able to assess risks and teaching our students how to evaluate them quickly and knowing which risks are going to be risks that they can evaluate and decide for themselves to carry forward will be really important. And the third thing is there's going to be much greater integration between people's careers and the rest of their lives. Through Positive Coaching Alliance, I had the chance to spend an afternoon with the legendary coach Phil Jackson, Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant's coach during their legendary NBA careers. And I was sitting with Phil in the garden of the Rosewood Hotel in Menlo Park, California, and I asked him a question that I tend to be very interested in. It's Stanford's application question: what matters most to you and why? And just as I asked the question, we were interrupted, and then I didn't see him again until our photos were being taken together a little bit later in the evening. And then he leaned over me, and you can kind of imagine as he was leaning over me, having Phil Jackson lean over you is a little bit like Gandalf leaning over Frodo if you're someone of Indian descent and you've got a 7-foot basketball star lowering over you. And he said, Pulin, I've been thinking of that that question you asked over in the garden. How would you answer it? And I immediately jumped to my students at Stanford. I said, Phil, I've launched an initiative at Stanford that is allowing me to have really meaningful conversations with each of my students. And I would say that they're the ones, right now, those conversations are really mattering to me. That's what matters to me the most. And he laughed when I said it. And he said, when I was at your stage, I was in my 40s, I would have answered something similar, something about my teams and guiding them to championships. I'm 67 now, and I realize that the answer is family. There is no other answer but family. And so I think that our students are moving into a time of life where what they do and how they live is going to be much more integrated together. It's going to be something that they personally create themselves as a reflection of what they want, not just their careers to be, but what they want their lives to be. And I think increasingly in our centers, being able to integrate the kind of life stuff with the career stuff is going to be important to how they navigate things. I have a board colleague at Yale, Tara Falcone, who's created this wonderful program on financial literacy that is informed by her own background navigating a lot of these topics without a lot of help as a first generation student to college. And she's now made that available to all students at Yale free of charge. And we're finding that it's incredibly popular and it's something that students really care about. And having that financial literacy is helping the students make better career decisions as well. I want to close because we're near the end of our time, but I want to close because as we go into Q&A and as you go off and think about with your centers, how do you want to think a little bit more deeply about how some of this reflects upon your center? I wanted to leave you with a few questions that are the things I would be thinking about myself if I was starting a new career center today. The first is, how will you balance personalized support of your students with the demands of trying to scale limited resources, often across large population sizes? We were able to do heavy personalization at Stanford because I had a staff of 18 professionals serving about 700, 800 students, and heavy personalization was embedded in our model. At Princeton, we had to get a lot more creative, thinking about how we would scale a slightly bigger staff, but now scaling it across 8,000 students. What role will technology and what role will your alumni base play in helping you to scale? How are you going to catalyze that learning spiral that we talked about? Encouraging your students not just to think about their first destination, but to embrace and engage with a lifelong mindset of being intentional and active learners about themselves, paying attention to everything that happens to them and integrating that in evolving so that every time they're making a decision, it's informed by what's happened before. How will you approach that question of the chain of mentorship? Not just fostering connections or fostering lots of conversations between your students and alumni, but actually how you are going to make it so that you create the best ingredients for those breakthrough relationships and those breakthrough moments to be able to happen. How are you going to support the employer base that exists today, a larger universe of smaller organizations that will stand alongside your larger organizations? One of the things we didn't have time to talk about today is that it's not only is it a challenge to figure out how to effectively support all the small employers, but it's also a challenge to figure out how to support your large employers when they are no longer getting the scale of hiring at your institutions that they've been used to getting in the past. And one of the things that is important is for your center to become partners to them in figuring out how to navigate the new normal. And then finally, how are you going to support your students at the intersection of career and life? What is the right line to draw? What is the right place to be? What topics around peer pressure, topics around risk and failure, topics around limiting beliefs like attitudes towards financial security, which of those are you going to carry forward with you into how you engage with and teach your students? I want to close with a quick anecdote. I did a podcast a week ago with Jordan from the UCLA team that was delightful. And Jordan asked me a question. What is the one question you would frame to everybody listening to the podcast? And I want to put that question I would frame in the context of a story. It was one of the most powerful experiences I had during my time at Stanford that actually happened when I was visiting Columbia University for a meeting and got stuck for half an hour in a cab in midtown traffic. And as I'm prone to do, I started having a great conversation with my cab driver, and I started asking him tons of questions about his work. And he began to tell me the story of his life. He had been 10 years old, growing up in Tibet when the occupation of Tibet had begun. And his family, fearing for his safety, had sent him across the border to Dharamsala in India. And he had wandered the streets of Dharamsala for a year without connections, without resources, and eventually got so homesick that he started to plan a way to get back home. And he found his way across the Himalayas and found his way back to his home, only to learn that his father had been captured and had died in prison. And his mother, now so fearing for his safety, sent him away again and told him in no uncertain terms to never return home again. So eventually he had found his way to New York and for many years had been driving that cab. I asked him what meaning and what purpose he found in driving that cab. It struck me that driving the cab was the very essence of what the Dalai Lama had described as job, working for the acquisition of resources. He lit up and he started to talk about his kids. His daughter had wanted to be a nurse and his son had wanted to be a math teacher. And he said that by driving this cab all these years, I made it possible for them to have the education that I never had. And then he really lit up and started talking about his grandchildren, many of whom had gone on to college. And it struck me in that moment that in the most basic of job, my cab driver had found a sense of calling. When I share this story with my students, I ask them to think about his life and his degrees of freedom. And then I ask them to think about their lives and their degrees of freedom. Freedom, everybody starts from different places and people have real pressures. I saw this, for example, with my first generation students. Many of them will have to go back and start supporting their families immediately after graduation. But if you have a lifelong mindset towards generating new degrees of freedom, you'll find that freedom is not a fixed asset, but is something that can be continued to generate as life continues to unfold. And if you don't start with full degrees of freedom at the beginning, you can continue to create it. And so the question I leave my students with, and it's a question I'll leave this talk with, the one question I think really matters: what are you going to do with your freedom? Thank you very much for having me. I think, Hassan, we'd be very happy to take some questions if anyone has some. I think
Yes.
the best place to put them is either through chat or Q&A, and I'm not going to try. See, there's a lot of chats and Q&A. I won't try to make sense of them in the moment. I'll let Hassan, the moderator.
We'll help coordinate that for you. Just want to say thank you so much for that incredible keynote. One of the things that I know I take away with it is, many career professionals, we're still figuring it out ourselves, right? We're still adding those degrees of freedom, and we're still searching for that, as you refer to it, the dividing line between work and the rest of your life, right? That calling, that intersection between career and life. So thank you so much. I'm actually gonna, we actually do have a couple of questions that have come through, and you're also welcome to raise your hand, and we will enable it so that you can ask the question live. But I'm gonna pass it on to my co-pilot, Michelle Ryan, who'll be helping us coordinate the QA. Michelle?
Yes, thank you. Hopefully, Pulin, we give you a moment here to take a breath, take a sip of water while I read a question. That was awesome. I speak for everyone when I say I've got so many notes now to take back to my team and discuss. So we so appreciate all of your expertise and sharing.
It's really my honor and my delight to be with you today and to be with this great group.
Wonderful. So yeah, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. I will repeat too, as Pulin mentioned, you can put your questions in the Q&A or you can just raise your hand. Because we're in a webinar, we will go in and manually unmute everyone that raises their hand. And then also for the Q&A, I'll read the questions out. If you asked the question in the Q&A, we'll also unmute you, but it's no pressure. If you don't want to speak, don't worry. We'll just have Pulin answer. But if you ask the question, we'll give you the opportunity to add some context or a follow-up if you'd like. So I'll get started. So our first question actually came really early. This is from Barry Morgan. It's an awesome question. So thank you, Barry, for this one. The question is, as the industry recovers, there will be a considerable amount of hiring and retraining needed. Can you offer advice as to the sort of skills the industry will need? Will training in leadership and supervision be needed, or will we need more entry-level skills, or both? So yeah. Big question for you to start with.
So it's a wonderful question. Thank you so much for that. And my overriding thought on it is that we're moving into a time of our history when society broadly, our government, our educational institutions, but also importantly, our companies are going to have a real responsibility to making sure that we adapt the opportunity for every member of society to be able to learn, to reskill, to stay on a constant growth curve, and to learn how to reinvent themselves so that we don't leave big parts of society behind as the economy rapidly changes. Let's take that example I was talking about ride sharing and car driving companies. The statistic I saw is that driving vehicles is the single biggest employer of males in American society. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 million people make their living driving vehicles in some uh, uh, way, shape, or form. Now, we see coming down the pike self-driving vehicles. We know that that's going to create a societal disruption. It's going to create massive unemployment if we're not ready to deal with it as a society. And one thing I think we've learned as a society is, particularly going through COVID and through all the changes that we're seeing happen through society right now, is that if big parts of our society get left behind, everybody suffers. Our whole society, the whole fabric of our society starts to suffer. So I think that right now is the time for companies, and particularly companies that think of themselves as leaders. I mean, I think of a company like Google, which has had such an extraordinary voice, such extraordinarily highly visible people, and what a role they can play in the education, the lifelong models of retraining and everything. And I think that the thing that's going to be important is for companies to feel a social responsibility as well as a responsibility to their own workforces. I think one of the challenges during this kind of current time is that, I talk about us being in a free agent economy. And it's true that as part of that free agent economy, for some of our students, it's a very empowering time for them to jump around, experiment with different parts of themselves, and be able to use new jobs as platforms to keep their growth going. But what that means is that they've had a more transactional relationship with their employers, and in return, their employers have a more transactional relationship with them. There no longer is any security. There's no longer any stability like what my dad experienced at Amoco or Standard Oil of Indiana. And so that social compact has changed a little bit. And now we're kind of a society, at least in the United States, everyone's kind of on their own, and there's a little bit of a social safety net, but got to kind of find your way. And I worry that if we combine, everyone's got to kind of find their own way, with big changes are coming and structural changes in society that are quickly going to change and obsolete a lot of jobs, and particularly blue collar jobs and particularly skill-based jobs where skills can quickly become obsolete. If we don't make a societal commitment to learning, I think that we're going to see political realignment. We're going to see unrest, and we can see that coming now. So it's not that hard. We need to get in front of it.
Awesome. Thank you. That was a really good question. Thank you, Barry.
That's a wonderful question.
Okay, so our next one here, this is also a really good one. They're not taking it easy on you today, Pulin. So the next one is, what are some systematic ways to embrace risk and practice adaptability in your career choices, especially for someone early in their career who has started on a more traditional career path?
Yeah. So the way that I think about risk-taking, at a macro level, the way that I think about risk-taking at any given time is that I want, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of what I spend my time doing to have a high probability of falling flat on its face. If I'm able to execute well enough at the other 80% of what I'm kind of within my comfort zone doing, I'm hoping that that will buy me enough of the goodwill and the credibility to allow the 20% of failure to be accepted and dealt with in stride and all of that. And by the way, that was exactly the same standard that I set for my organization. So I said to my teams that it would be great if we can find a place where we're really swinging for the fences. 80% of what we do is succeeding. 20% of what we do might fall flat on its face, but then might evolve or iterate with the next generation of how we evolve it. And that's a good place to be. When navigating risk, and how I advise students to navigate risk, is to take smaller risks that inform how you make decisions on the larger risks before they happen. So I'll give like a personal example of this in two directions, my way to Princeton and my way back from Princeton. My way to Princeton, the big risk that we were facing at a personal level was relocation of my family. We had been in the Bay Area for 25 years or 20 years at that time. And we had been established here. Now we're going to a new geography. What's it going to be like for the kids to be getting into new schools? What's going to be like for my wife, who's an entrepreneur, to be able to find work within the New Jersey or maybe New York economy? And this was the big holdup, and it was a holdup that ended up sticking, in my process with Princeton for many months before I finally accepted the offer. But once Princeton and we were able to identify that that was where we were getting hung up, we came up with a lot of strategies. The trustees got involved with working with my wife to help her with her job search and helping to build confidence that she'd be able to find stuff within the Princeton geography that would be interesting for her to pursue. We brought the kids out to tour the school that they'd be in and see how they like the community. And before we made the decision to accept the offer, started to see how it would be. And most importantly, Princeton helped me to secure a home to rent on campus, which allowed us to keep our home in the Bay Area, so that there was, a little bit of a safety valve if we move out to Princeton and we decide we want to come back, we haven't lost our foothold in the Bay Area. And all of that stuff was a way of progressively de-risking the riskiest part of what we were navigating. On the way back from Princeton, as I was launching in this new phase of writing a book, the big thing that was the risk factor there was getting published as a first-time author. And the way that I was able to get that by that very quickly before even leaving New Jersey, by having the chance to meet with the publisher of one of the great publishing houses, and then being able to sign with my agent and being able to build a lifelong friendship with one of the other agents and get comfortable with that side of things. And that gave me more confidence to launch into this new phase of life. And so you don't want to just jump off the cliff into a risky path, but I think that you do need to be embracing a level of risk. If you don't have the mindset, the thing that has made a career fulfilling for me has been spending as much of my career as I can at the frontier of my potential rather than in my comfort zone. And by being in the frontier of my potential, I have grown in deep ways. I remember when I took my first job at Stanford, I don't think I'd given those big public speeches at the beginning. I think I hit my first speech, I'd written out like in exhaustive detail and then memorized it. Speaking is like one of the things that I'm most personally comfortable with now, and I grew into it. It's become something that by taking the risk to get up in front of audiences and start speaking, it's something that I've gone from being scared of at the beginning now into something I really look forward to, really enjoy doing, and have a lot of fun with. So I think that that's what I want our students to be doing, is pushing themselves to that frontier zone where about 20% of what they're doing is stuff that they're worried they will fall completely flat on, and teaching them to not be disappointed or afraid when they fall flat, but instead to have that Carol Dweck growth mindset of taking that 20% as the chance to really push their frontier outwards. Because remember that personal value is going to be, when you get to the mastery phase of career, you start to really be able to write your own destiny by being differentiated from the rest of the world. I think that I don't know, I'm not going to speak for how my colleagues at Princeton would describe me, but I suspect that very few of them would describe me just as an academic administrator. I think they would describe me in terms that are directly tied to how my career has grown. They would describe me maybe as a change agent and an entrepreneur or something like that. And I think that we want to teach our students to start to find all those very personalized identities for themselves.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you for that question from our audience. We've got another one here that I will share with you. This is from anonymous attendee. So it says, thank you very much for all of the insight you shared. My question is, have you found ways to engage alumni, and it says in parentheses here, especially BIPOC, first gen and or low income alumni, in a way where they are offered some form of honorarium or compensation for their time, effort, and work of connecting with current students and looking for internships and jobs?
So that's a beautiful question. It's an opportunity, I think, to highlight that our students from different forms of diverse backgrounds, as well as our students who come from first generation or low income backgrounds, um, are at the heart of not just the career offices, but the heart of how at least the universities that I'm part of are thinking about every part of their system. Such a major priority. I mean, if you just look, for example, at first generation and low income background students, at Princeton now, our best estimate is that they represent directionally about 25% of the class. Yale might be just a little couple of percentage points behind that. They're a major part of our, our effectiveness as an office is being good with them. And being able to meet them where they are and being able to be relevant and being able to support. So I think that what I would say is that alumni are absolutely critical to how we support not just those populations, but really every part of our population. I think that we didn't talk too much about scaling. I want to talk a little bit about scaling now, because if you are aspiring to provide what really feels like very personalized support across your entire base of users, and personalized doesn't just mean direct conversations and directly targeted, but it means relevant, talking about the issues that I most care about and all of that. Alumni become really critical to unlocking that, because if you can build a large group of alumni who will be active volunteers, the alumni love to do it because they love working with students, they love engaging with students, and they become the key to scaling. With our first generation and low income background students, the alumni are especially critical because they are especially active. They remember how supported or not supported they felt during their own college experiences. They feel a special, both often in special positions to open things up for our students, but they also just feel a special calling to be activist. And we created a number of different forums. So for example, a dinner series where we brought groups of students together with alumni to just be able to form those relationships more organically. The one thing I would say in response to that question is that we never at any of my institutions used any form of honorarium or compensation. Everything was always done as a volunteer effort. And in our cases, that was always enough. And we were able to get tons of alumni to come and to join in. It takes, I guess, some work to be able to build the networks, to start to facilitate the connections and all of that. But I'll say, because I'm pretty active as an alum volunteer for Yale, my own undergraduate institution, if a student reaches out to me, I will always say yes. No matter what's going on, I will drop things and I will find time to meet with them. And so the art, I think, becomes around the matching, not around the incentivizing.
Wonderful, thank you. We don't have any formal questions in the Q&A, which I think is great. Actually, I'd love to open it up for our guests to just raise their hands. We've got a lot of attendees here today, a lot of, as Hassan mentioned in the chat, directors of career centers. So I'd love to hear from our guests. If you raise your hand, we can go ahead and unmute you. Feel free to kind of join in, ask a question, or if you have any comments or just insight to share with the group, we'd love to hear from all of you. And we've got a few minutes left, so feel free.
In the meantime, while folks think about their questions, Pulin, tell us a little bit about what's next for you in your career. We know you have a book coming out. I dropped your LinkedIn into the chat as well. But anything you want to share, how folks can get in touch with you, what's next on your plate?
So first of all, feel free to get in touch with me on LinkedIn and let me know that you were part of today's webinar, and I'd love to connect with you, love to have conversation, would love to support and help you in whatever way that I can. And it's great to be connected with you. In terms of my own life, I am busy with the writing process, and a big part, Hassan, as I shared with your group in the morning, is that I am doing a lot of translation of everything that I know about this economy, making it relevant for everybody in the economy. So I am moving beyond pure sort of the audiences that I've had great access to in the past, now to create content for people who are launching restaurants or aspiring to become nurses or police officers, or who are working in factories who want to incorporate a lot of this kind of this idea of active generative freedom, generation of freedom into their lives. I do a great deal of speaking. I do a great deal of teaching in different formats. I'm fortunate to have a wonderful connection with all three of my institutions, with Princeton. I have wonderful groups of students coming out to visit, and collaborations with many of my former colleagues at Yale. I'm a fellow in Davenport College, my residential college, and I've had the wonderful chance to teach to and engage with students over the course of this pandemic year. And at Stanford, I've been a mentor, a formal mentor to the Knight Hennessy Scholars Program, and it's been very fulfilling to keep a foot in each university.
Wonderful. I got one private message question, Michelle. It says, finding our career and life vision, finding a calling is easier said than done. What's one or two pieces of advice you have for all the career services professionals who really are looking and seeking to combine their career and life vision and to really find that intersection? Historically, work and life compete with each other, especially now that it's all blurred, right, with the virtual world we're living in. What advice do you have for us?
So that's a fantastic question. I want to give a high-level answer, but then I think the spirit of the question is for everybody in this call thinking of their own careers. And I want to really kind of embrace that, because that's something I care about a lot, and I might just hop into the role of career coach for a moment. I think the big thing I want to say about where the challenge is that I think it doesn't come as a blinding flash of revelation and suddenly you know what you're meant to do with the rest of your life. For me, and certainly for all the students I've worked with over 12 years now of teaching this, it's a lifelong process that requires that mindfulness and that intentionality to keep asking questions and evolving the hypothesis. One of the things that's been so beautiful is that I have students from my first days at Stanford reaching out to me still now saying, I'm 10 years into my career and I haven't stopped thinking about, where my hypothesis is going next. And would it be okay to have a follow-on conversation to think from where I've invested over the last 10 years, where to go now? And I think that recognizing that this is a lifelong commitment, you asked me, Hassan, where do I think things are going in the next 10 years? I have some thematic North Star I'm sailing towards, which is this intersection of writing and speaking and generating content. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but that ambiguity is something that I love and that I embrace. And then for the specific kind of advice I would give you in building your career within this field, and then within your broader university, and then maybe outside of your university, I would say that you may or may not find that my story has resonated with you today, but I'll say that everything that has happened for me, everything that I have had happen, I think is available for everybody to find. It might be in different form. It might be more tailored to your specific goals and everything else. The things that have guided me well throughout my career, first in higher ed and then now outside of higher ed, is to recognize that universities are not great places on their own for career development. Universities often just find people to take roles that if you're doing well in that role, they will like to keep you in that role, and you might stay in that role forever. So you have to be an active advocate for yourself, start stretching into new responsibilities and new goals. An example I used was that we had somebody on my team at Princeton who was really, aspiring to become an advisor. And I think our office, by understanding that goal that she had, and by working with her at every stage of the process, um, that shift became possible. And we had so many members of our team who went through promotions or multiple promotions, and most of it was fueled by growth and by a restlessness to keep developing the least comfortable parts of themselves, to keep trying new parts of themselves out. You may, depending on your work situation, you may find that you have a direct manager who is more or less receptive to that. You may find that you have to work less hard or more hard at that. But I think it's that process of continuing the same things we would guide our students to do, is keep uh, making that bouquet out of the flowers that are within reach of your own role, keep building mentors and active sponsors within your organization, keep pushing yourself towards new areas of growth for yourself, and then start thinking about how that spikiness that you're developing in yourself, the unique things that you are developing and learning to do, how those ingredients can come together uniquely to make you uniquely well suited for whatever you're aspiring to do next. And I'll say that when I took my role at Stanford and I was going through the search process with the search committee, I'll say that I'm not sure they knew exactly what to do with me coming out of McKinsey, never having managed a university team or a university organization, and never having been in the career services field. I was able to anchor them on the vision of what I would do at the center. And once they bought into the center, once they bought into the vision, then I was probably the right person in their eyes to lead that change. However, when Princeton came along, they wanted change. The trustees had already decided that. And because I had started to develop my own identity around being a change agent, driving change in this space, that was such an easy search. They honed in on me, and it was such a natural fit with what they were looking for. So recognize that as your career develops, that's going to happen in your career too. You can't be afraid of shutting doors. Instead, what you want to do is recognize that if you become specialized and then hyper specialized, but then become hyper specialized in a platform that has room to grow with you, that can become a good mastery level identity, you'll start to be able to create your own situations. And I don't think I had enough time to do this question justice, but if whoever had that question wants to reach out, I'm happy to have a longer conversation about it.
No, I think you did great. We are pretty much at time here today. I want to give you the opportunity. Pulin, do you have any last parting words for us before I go into a spiel of thank yous and closing remarks? Any last comments?
I think my last comment that I would make is I don't know most of you personally on this call, but I now have, particularly now having both worked within our field for so many years and now being outside of our field, but working so closely still with the students that we impact on a day-to-day basis. I guess there are a few things that I want to just express. I mean, number one, each of you are rock stars in what you're doing. The mission that you are going after, the dedication that you have, the dedication that our field has towards this is the most important thing in the world for many of our students, figuring out what their lives are going to become. And your dedication, your power, your energy, the long hours that you work to stay a little bit later, to stay late for one student who really needs you, the discipline you go in kind of making your programs a little bit better because it's going to help the students is truly inspiring. So I guess the message I'd leave each of you with is I think that trust yourself and believe in what you can create within your institutions by trusting yourself. Virtually everything we did at Stanford and everything we did at Princeton, we created from the ground up, just thinking about here are our students and here's what they need. Here's what they're asking for. Let's listen to them. Let's think about what they're asking for. Let's question every assumption we have about how what we're doing is working. And from the ground up, we were able to build models that became really effective in short periods of time. Each of you can do that in your institutions, and I have no doubt will, and I'm just inspired to have had this chance to spend time with you, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Pulin. We're gonna give you a break here. Please feel free, take a breath, take a glass of water. I'm gonna end our session today. We are at time, especially for all of our East Coast and international guests that are joining us deep into their Friday evening. Thank you all for being here. I will just say, like, I'm sure I'm not alone after this session, having just a lot of inspiration. I have a lot of notes I'm going to bring back to my team. We're going to discuss it at length. And as we head into summer planning for the year, I know we all have a lot to think about. So I want to thank Pulin again for joining us. You've been so generous with your time and your insight on our work in the industry. We are so lucky to have you. We hope all of our attendees enjoyed today's session. I do also want to thank Pulin again for being on our podcast. Also, our Career Center launched our podcast this week as part of the Future of Work conference, and Pulin was fantastic, of course, being our first guest. So if you didn't get a chance to listen to that, I think we put a link to it in the chat. Please go ahead and check that out. And then I hope everyone who was part of our entire Future of Work conference gained as much from our speakers and guests as I did. We do plan to make this an annual event, so keep an eye out for 2022 details. I think the team needs a breather, so give us a minute. We won't be sending out the 2022 lineup on Monday morning or anything, but we will absolutely be in touch. We're excited to start planning for next year. And then to continue with some of our final thank yous, our entire department came together to make this conference happen. So I want to give a special thanks to the UCLA Career Center team, who really for the past 6 weeks have been full steam ahead with event planning and bringing in panelists and creating exceptional programs. It's been an incredible week. Finally, we could not leave this session without thanking our executive director, Hassan. This conference absolutely would not have happened without him, and certainly without his leadership. He pushes us all to be better and do more, and I just want to express my appreciation for his constant support and his mentorship. So thank you, Hassan. He's also the reason we were able to score Pulin as a keynote for today. So thank you again.
I gotta say, I said this morning, and I'm gonna say it here too, is that my friendship with Hassan has definitely been unbalanced in my favor. The level of inspiration and the amount that I've learned from Hassan has been way out of proportion to whatever I've given into the relationship. So Hassan, thank you for having me, and it's wonderful to have you, have you in my world.
No, thank you so much, both of you.
Wonderful. And Pulin earlier today called you a true advocate, which I think is really great. And we'll get a plaque for your office once we get back to the office so we can actually see whatever is put on your door. We'll add to your poster collection. So also I want to thank our UCLA senior leadership team, our Vice Chancellor and our Assistant Vice Chancellor. I want to thank them for their support and for giving us the green light really to host this and to open it up and to build a consortium at UCLA. That is not always an easy thing to get done at such a large university. So we greatly appreciate them supporting this effort. And so I'm just going to wrap up today. I want to say that listening to our colleagues across the country and the world, actually, we had international guests today, really brings back to basics about how we're all striving toward the same mission as we reflect back on a year of massive upheaval, not just in our work and our profession, but in our personal lives and in the lives of our students, that it helps to focus on what's important and how we use our time and our energy to create real impact. We had, as people mentioned earlier, we had a UCLA specific session this morning discussing a lot of the same topics we've all been tackling this year, from student engagement to staff development and staff morale to funding challenges and budget cuts. And it all does come back to the question of how can we help one another? When we envision the future of career services, if we don't see increased collaboration and information gathering and data sharing, then we are way off. How are we innovating and pivoting together as a profession and as an industry to support new diverse talent pipelines? How are we developing a new era of career services professionals who are in hybrid roles offering hybrid services? We all have similar experiences and similar questions, and it has just been really nice to come together to reflect on it as a community and as a consortium, especially as the quarantine and remote work has sometimes isolated us from our peers and our coworkers. So this past week, we've hosted this inaugural Future of Work conference, and we brought together these incredible speakers. Our keynote from Monday, Wayne Kimball Jr., just set the tone for planning for the pivot, and our week of programs were a deep dive into the future of industry, what our employers will be looking for in applicants moving forward, how our students need to shift their focus or pivot their plans to navigate this past year's disruption. And I think that ending the week with a focus on our work and career services is a great way to shift toward our role in preparing students for the future of work. We need to change with our students. We cannot expect them to completely shift their goals and approach and their skills and not anticipate the same expectation be placed on ourselves and our teams. With any massive shift like this, we can always identify opportunities alongside the challenges. So the questions for us today are, how do we try and take advantage of what's happened over the past year? I will say I never felt that there was a chance that working for a large university would offer me an option to work remotely or have a flexible schedule. I certainly never anticipated that I would need to become an expert in virtual meeting platforms or organizing large-scale virtual engagement events. Marketing and social media have changed exponentially. How are career centers participating in that? Our old roles and our old job descriptions do not work for a new generation of students entering a new and shifting economy. We have spent decades repackaging, and so let's take this opportunity to create a genuinely new product. As Pulin mentioned, with innovation comes risk. We did not manage every day and every event and every meeting and fare this past year perfectly. I will go on to say we had to fail a lot in the beginning before we got comfortable in this new space and felt like we got our bearings again. And I want to challenge this group and say, let's not strive for comfortable again. A new normal, sure. I think we would all really like that. But resting on our laurels or reverting back to the old formula once our campuses reopen is not what our students need. We have to take some risks, be willing to fail, probably a lot, but at the end of the day, we'll grow and our students will be the benefactors of that. So as we wrap up this session and this week, and what's been like the hardest year for some of us as professionals and as people, I'd love for us to look back at everything that we've been able to accomplish. We can certainly look ahead and be certain in the knowledge that we can do difficult things and succeed in spite of challenges. And if we can navigate a global pandemic while continuing to serve our students at the highest level and still work toward transforming our profession to build a stronger, more inclusive model moving forward, what else can we do? What else are we capable of? I'm personally really excited to see what's next for us, and I hope that you are all too. So I want to end on that note, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks, Paul, and thanks to all the attendees. Honored to have you, and we hope to see you next year.